In the heart of what was once the greatest city the ancient world had known, where Rome spreads across 7 hills that cradled civilization, where Forum Romanum lies exposed to modern sky after centuries buried beneath later construction, where columns that once supported temples now stand isolated like teeth in ancient jaw, where marble fragments lie scattered across ground that once rang with footsteps of senators and slaves, emperors and merchants, advocates and accusers, where stones that were quarried centuries before Christ and shaped into monuments celebrating power now rest weathered and broken and silent. In this space that was center of Roman world, that was heart of empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from Rhine to Sahara, that was place where political decisions were made and religious rituals performed, and commercial transactions conducted and legal judgments rendered, where all the activities that made Rome into Rome occurred in concentrated space. Mary Beard stands among ruins and asks questions that transform how we see what remains, that make visible what previous scholarship had not noticed, that reveal how marble holds memory but holds it ambiguously, holds it in ways that require interpretation rather than simple reading, holds it as propaganda rather than as truth. The Forum was never neutral space, was never simply public square where Romans gathered, but was instead carefully constructed ideological statement, was designed to communicate messages about power, was filled with monuments that proclaimed achievements of those who commissioned them, that celebrated military victories and political successes and family glories, that created version of history that served interests of powerful, that preserved memory selectively, that chose what to commemorate and what to forget, the selectivity being visible to critical eye, being evident in whose statues dominated Forum and whose were absent, in what events were memorialized in stone and what events left no trace, in how victories were celebrated while defeats were obscured, how certain families' contributions were magnified while others were minimized. The Forum being not transparent record of Roman history, but being contested space where different versions of history competed, where power inscribed itself in marble, where memory was constructed rather than simply preserved. Mary Beard reads the Forum as text reads it by asking who created monuments, who paid for them, what purposes they served, what messages they communicated, what they revealed inadvertently even while attempting to control narrative, the reading being critical reading, being approach that does not accept monuments at face value but interrogates them, that asks whose interests they served, whose voices they silenced, whose versions of events they promoted. The interrogation revealing Forum as palimpsest where layers of meaning overlap, where earlier monuments were destroyed or repurposed or obscured by later ones, where Augustus's building program transformed space that had evolved organically into carefully designed propaganda celebrating his regime, where each emperor added monuments celebrating himself while sometimes destroying or modifying predecessors' monuments, the palimpsest being visible in archaeological record. In how foundations of earlier structures underlie later buildings, in how stones from dismantled monuments were reused in new constructions, in how space was constantly being remade to serve current powers' needs. The statues that populated Forum were overwhelmingly male, were depicting emperors and generals and senators, were commemorating men who wielded political and military power, were preserving in bronze and marble the faces and deeds of those whom Rome considered important, the overwhelming maleness being not reflection of Roman reality. Women were half the population. Women were essential to Roman society's functioning, but being reflection of who had power to commission statues, who had authority to occupy public space, who was considered worthy of permanent commemoration. The statue's gender distribution revealing power structures, revealing that public memory was male memory, that history as preserved in Forum was history of men's achievements, men's conflicts, men's glories, the revelation being Mary Beard's point, being her recognition that what Forum preserves is not complete picture of Rome, but is selective memory shaped by patriarchy, shaped by values that considered men's public activities worthy of commemoration, while treating women's lives as private matters, not deserving permanent monuments. The triumphal arches that still stand were celebrating military victories, were monuments to conquest, were proclamations of empire's expansion, were testimonies to violence that Rome inflicted on others in creating empire that would rule Mediterranean world, the celebration being encoded in reliefs that showed defeated enemies in chains, that depicted spoils being paraded through streets, that commemorated subjugation of peoples who became subjects of Rome. The arches being propaganda that presented conquest as glorious achievement rather than as brutal violence, that transformed suffering of conquered into celebration for conquerors, that made imperialism into virtue, the propaganda being effective because it was permanent, because marble endured, because generations of Romans would walk beneath arches and absorb messages they communicated, would internalize values they promoted, would accept conquest as normal and desirable. Mary Beard reading arches critically, reading them as evidence of imperial ideology, reading them as monuments to violence that must be acknowledged rather than celebrated, as testimonies to costs of empire that traditional histories often minimize. The temples that dominated Forum's skyline were dedicated to gods who protected Rome, were religious monuments but also political statements. We're expressing through architecture Rome's special relationship with divine. We're proclaiming that gods favored Rome, that empire was divinely sanctioned, that Roman success proved divine approval, the temples being sites where religion and politics merged, where worship served state, where rituals reinforced power structures, where priests who conducted ceremonies were also political figures, where distinction between sacred and secular that modern world assumes did not exist, the temples being testimony to how Rome used religion, how state appropriated divine authority, how worship of gods became mechanism for maintaining social order and legitimizing imperial power. Mary Beard reading temples not just as religious architecture, but as political monuments, as evidence of how power constructed ideological frameworks that made its rules seem natural, inevitable, divinely ordained. The inscriptions that cover Forum's remains are speaking with voices that reveal more than they intend, are dedicatory inscriptions commissioned by emperors and senators, are epitaphs commemorating the dead, are official records of laws and decrees, are graffiti added by visitors across centuries, the voices being multiple, being layered, being sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes inadvertently revealing what official pronouncements tried to hide, the inscriptions being evidence that must be read carefully, must be interpreted critically, must be understood as products of their time rather than as objective records. Mary Beard reading inscriptions for what they reveal about power, about propaganda, about attempts to control memory, about gaps between official versions and actual events, about how language was used to obscure as much as to communicate, the reading being detective work, being uncovering evidence from sources that were not designed to provide evidence, that were created for other purposes, but that preserve despite themselves information that critical historian can recover. The Forum's layout reveals power, reveals through organization of space how Rome structured itself hierarchically, how different areas were designated for different activities, how access was controlled, how proximity to center signified importance, how placement of monuments communicated status, the layout being not accidental but being carefully designed to express and reinforce social order, to make visible through architecture and urban planning the hierarchies that structured Roman society, to create physical environment that made power relations seem natural, the layout being evidence of how space is political, how built environment shapes behavior and thought, how architectural choices express values and maintain structures. Mary Beard reading Forum's layout as evidence of power, as testimony to how Rome organized itself, as material manifestation of social structures that determined who could occupy which spaces, who could participate in which activities, who had access to power and who was excluded from it. The forum where marble holds memory is space that Mary Beard critically approaches by questioning rather than accepting, by interrogating rather than admiring, by recognizing that monuments were propaganda, that memory was selective, that what was preserved served interests of powerful, that recovering fuller picture of Roman life requires looking beyond official monuments, requires attending to what is absent as much as to what is present, requires reading against grain of sources. Requires acknowledging that Forum shows us not Rome as it was, but Rome as elite men wanted it to be remembered. The approach being different from traditional Roman history that often accepted Forum's monuments as evidence without sufficiently questioning what they obscured, what they excluded, what versions of events they promoted. Mary Beard's Forum being more complex space than traditional interpretations allowed, being site of propaganda rather than of truth. Being contested space rather than neutral ground, being place where memory was constructed rather than simply preserved, the marble holding memory but holding it ambiguously, holding it in ways that require a historian who questions, who challenges, who refuses to accept what stones proclaim, who reads critically what marble holds, the Forum where marble holds memory being introduction to Mary Beard's approach, being demonstration of how critical history works, being invitation to question. To examine, to recognize complexity, to understand that recovering past requires more than cataloging monuments, requires interpretation, requires recognizing that sources are problematic, requires acknowledging that memory is always selective, always political, always serving interests. The Forum's marble-holding memory that Mary Beard teaches us to read critically, to question persistently, to understand as constructed rather than as simply preserved. In Cambridge, where ancient manuscripts are preserved in Climatech-controlled archives, where vellum and parchment that survived centuries of copying hold words written by Romans 2,000 years ago, where Mary Beard sits reading Latin texts that have come down through complex transmission history, through medieval monasteries where monks copied manuscripts, through Renaissance scholars who edited texts, through modern editors who established critical editions. The texts speaking with voices from past, but voices that are mediated, are shaped by transmission, are incomplete because many works were lost, are corrupted by errors that accumulated through copying, are fragmentary because complete texts rarely survived. The library being place where Mary Beard practices critical reading, where she approaches texts with skepticism, where she asks not just what texts say but why they say it, who wrote them for what audience, with what purposes, what biases shaped them. What assumptions underlie them, what they reveal inadvertently even while attempting to communicate particular messages. The reading being active interrogation rather than passive reception, being engagement with texts that recognizes they are not transparent windows into past but are constructed artifacts that must be interpreted, must be questioned, must be understood as products of particular historical moments and particular social positions. The letters of Cicero survive in substantial numbers, survive because medieval scholars valued them, because they were copied and preserved, because Cicero's elegant Latin made him model for students learning language, the letters being window into late Republic, being testimony to political crisis that destroyed Republican government and led to Augustus's establishment of empire, being evidence of how Roman elite conducted politics, formed alliances, competed for power. The letters being valuable historical sources, but being also problematic sources because Cicero wrote them with eye toward publication, wrote them knowing or hoping they would be preserved, wrote them to present himself in particular light, to justify his actions, to attack his enemies, to promote his version of events, the letters being shaped by Cicero's purposes, being colored by his biases. Being partial in both senses, being incomplete, and being biased. Mary Beard reading Cicero's letters critically, reading them for what they reveal about Cicero, but also for what they reveal despite Cicero, for evidence they preserve even while pursuing rhetorical goals, for details they include that were not central to Cicero's purposes but that are valuable to historians, for moments when Cicero inadvertently reveals assumptions or prejudices or information that critical reading can recover. The histories that Livy and Tacitus wrote are not objective chronicles, are not simply recording what happened, but are interpretations shaped by authors' values, by their political positions, by their rhetorical training that taught them to construct narratives that would persuade readers, by their purposes in writing which were not modern historians' purpose of discovering what actually happened, but were purposes of providing moral instruction, of celebrating or criticizing regimes, of demonstrating literary skill, of exploring human nature through historical examples, the histories being literary works as much as historical works, being constructed according to conventions that allowed invention of speeches, that permitted dramatic elaboration, that valued artistic effect alongside factual accuracy. Mary Beard reading ancient histories not as straightforward accounts of events, but as complex texts that must be analyzed for their literary strategies, for their rhetorical purposes, for their ideological commitments, for what they assume, for what they exclude, for whose perspectives they adopt and whose they ignore, the reading being recognition that ancient historiography was different genre than modern historiography, that judging ancient historians by modern standards is anachronistic, that understanding what ancient histories can tell us requires understanding how they were written, what conventions govern them, what purposes shaped them. The biographies that Suetonius wrote of 12 Caesars are filled with gossip, are repeating scandalous stories about emperors' private lives, are recounting sexual behavior and cruelty and excess, are presenting emperors as individuals with vices and virtues rather than simply as holders of office. The biographies being valuable sources for understanding how Romans thought about power, about proper and improper behavior of rulers, about relationship between private character and public role, but being problematic sources for determining what actually happened because Suetonius repeated stories without always verifying them, because gossip served particular purposes in Roman culture, because scandalous stories about emperors who were dead were safe to repeat in ways that similar stories about living emperors would not have been, the biographies being evidence of biographical genres conventions, of how Roman elite talked about power, of what stories they told about rulers, but not being reliable guides to emperors' actual behavior. Mary Beard reading Suetonius critically, reading him for what biographies reveal about genre, about values, about culture of gossip, about how private lives of powerful were discussed, but not accepting stories as factual without corroborating evidence. The poetry that Ovid and Catullus and others wrote is sometimes used as historical evidence, is read for what it reveals about social customs, about gender relations, about daily life, about values and attitudes, the poetry being valuable source when read carefully, when interpreted with awareness of genre conventions, when understood as constructed literary works rather than as transparent reflections of reality, but being problematic when read naively. When poetic statements are taken as factual claims, when literary topoi are mistaken for social realities, when conventions of love poetry are interpreted as descriptions of actual relationships, Mary Beard approaching poetry as evidence that requires sophisticated interpretation, that must be read with awareness of literary traditions, that reveals culture but reveals it indirectly, that shows us not how Romans lived but how they imagined, fantasized, constructed ideals, complained. Played with language and ideas, the poetry being testimony to Roman culture but being testimony that must be read critically, that must be interpreted carefully, that must not be confused with documentary evidence. The legal texts that survive laws, legal commentaries, court speeches are revealing Roman society through rules that governed it, through disputes that arose, through how Romans thought about property and family and crime and obligation. The legal texts being among most valuable sources for social history, for understanding how Rome organized itself, how it dealt with conflicts, how it defined categories like citizen and slave, man and woman, legitimate and illegitimate. The texts being valuable but also being limited, being showing us law rather than practice, being revealing what was supposed to happen rather than what actually happened, being evidence of elite male jurists thinking rather than of how ordinary people experienced legal system. Mary Beard using legal texts carefully, using them for what they can reveal while recognizing their limitations, recognizing that law and practice often diverged, that what legal texts prohibited often continued. That rules reflected ideals and interests of those who made them rather than describing social realities completely. The inscriptions that were carved in stone and that survive throughout former Roman Empire are providing evidence that literary sources do not provide, are preserving voices of people who did not write books, are recording dedications and epitaphs and public announcements, are showing us how people wanted to be remembered, what they valued, what relationships mattered to them, what achievements they celebrated. The inscriptions being valuable precisely because they come from broader cross-section of society than literary texts do, being valuable because they were meant for local audiences rather than for posterity, being valuable because they preserve formulaic language that reveals cultural assumptions, the inscriptions being evidence that Mary Beard uses extensively, that she mines for information about social structures, about families, about local communities, about how empire actually functioned at local level, the inscriptions being texts that betray their authors by revealing through formulas and conventions and small variations from conventions what Roman society valued, how it organized itself, how individuals positioned themselves within it. The library where texts betray their authors is space where Mary Beard practices critical reading practices by asking who wrote text and why, for whom and with what purposes, what biases shaped it, what assumptions underlay it, what it reveals inadvertently while pursuing conscious goals, the practice being essential to historical work, being recognition that sources are not transparent, are not objective, are not simply telling us what happened but are constructed artifacts that must be interrogated, must be interpreted, must be understood in contexts, must be read both for what they say and for what they do not say, for what they assume, for what they exclude, for whose perspectives they adopt and whose they ignore. The critical reading being Mary Beard's method, being her approach to recovering past from problematic sources, being her recognition that texts betray their authors by revealing more than authors intended, by preserving despite themselves evidence that critical readers can recover, by showing through what they take for granted, through what they do not bother to explain, through what they mention in passing, evidence of culture, of values, of social structures, of realities that authors were not consciously documenting, but that survive in texts for historians who know how to read them. The library where texts betray their authors being place where Mary Beard works, where she reads Latin, where she interprets sources, where she constructs understanding of Rome from fragmentary and biased evidence, where she demonstrates that critical reading can recover past even from sources that were not designed to preserve it, that texts betray their authors by revealing what they did not intend to reveal, that history can be written from sources that are problematic when those sources are read critically, interpreted carefully, questioned persistently. The marble statues that populate museums displaying Roman art, that stand in galleries where visitors admire classical beauty, that represent Roman world in frozen stone showing togas and tunics, armor and imperial regalia, faces that were intended to be recognizable, bodies that were idealized according to conventions. These statues are overwhelmingly male, are depicting emperors standing in heroic poses, generals commemorated for victories, senators portrayed in dignity of office, philosophers shown in contemplation, poets remembered for literary achievements, the statues being monuments to men who wielded power, who made decisions that affected empire, who were considered worthy of commemoration in expensive materials by sculptors whose work required skill and patronage. The overwhelming maleness of statuary being not accident, not reflecting that men were all who mattered in Rome, not showing that women were absent from Roman life, but being instead testimony to who had power to commission statues, who controlled public space, who was considered appropriate subject for permanent commemoration, whose memory deserved preservation in marble that would outlast flesh and that would speak to future generations about who was important, who mattered, who was worth remembering. Mary Beard reads the statuary's gender distribution as evidence, reads it not as showing that women were unimportant, but as showing that women were excluded from public commemoration, that patriarchal values determined whose images populated public spaces, that power structures shaped memory, that official commemoration was male domain even when women wielded influence, even when women were essential to empires' functioning. Even when individual women like Livia or Agrippina or Julia Domna exercised power that arguably exceeded many senators, the exclusion from statuary being evidence of how Roman society organized itself, how it thought about gender, how it assigned public and private spheres, how it determined what was appropriate for permanent commemoration and what was not, the statue's silence about women being testimony that must be interpreted, that reveals through absence. That shows through what is not depicted as much as through what is depicted, the silence being eloquent, being evidence of patriarchy, being demonstration of how power shapes memory. The few statues of women that do survive are mostly depicting women in relation to men, are showing women as wives of emperors, as mothers of emperors, as daughters of powerful families, the women being commemorated not for their own achievements but for their relationships to men who held power, the relational commemoration being revealing of how Roman society understood women's roles, how it valued women for reproductive and dynastic functions rather than for individual accomplishments, how it incorporated women into public memory only when they could be attached to men whose importance justified commemoration. Mary Beard analyzing these statues for what they reveal about gender ideology, about how women were supposed to function in Roman society, about what roles were considered appropriate, about how even powerful women were represented in ways that subordinated them to men, that emphasized their relationships rather than their agency, that made them adjuncts to men's power rather than wielders of power themselves. The portrait heads of women that survive are showing women's fashions, are depicting elaborate hairstyles that changed with each generation, are preserving evidence of how women presented themselves, how they signaled status through appearance, how fashion was political because adopting empress's hairstyle was showing loyalty to regime, how personal appearance was public statement, the portrait heads being evidence of aspects of Roman women's lives that literary sources rarely discuss in detail, being testimony to material culture, to how women managed their appearance, to role of hairdressers and jewelry and cosmetics in constructing identity. Mary Beard using portrait heads as evidence for recovering aspects of women's lives that other sources do not preserve, reading them for what they reveal about fashion, about presentation, about how women navigated society, about how appearance communicated meaning in culture that was highly attentive to visual signals. The mythological statuary depicting goddesses and female personifications is different from portrait statuary, is showing idealized female forms, is using women's bodies to represent abstract concepts like victory or peace or abundance, is making female form into vehicle for symbolic meaning, the mythological statuary being testimony to how Roman culture used gender symbolically, how it associated certain qualities with femininity, how it represented abstractions through gendered bodies, but being also different from how actual women were commemorated, being fantasy rather than portrait, being ideal rather than individual, being evidence of cultural imagination rather than of women's actual lives. Mary Beard distinguishing between mythological representations and portraits, between symbolic use of female form and commemoration of actual women. The distinction being important for understanding what different kinds of statuary can tell us about Roman culture, about gender ideology, about how real women's lives related to cultural ideals. The absence of working women from statuary is striking, is absence of women who worked in shops, who managed businesses, who practiced trades, who were essential to Roman economy's functioning. The absence being not because such women did not exist, but because they were not considered appropriate subjects for public commemoration, because statuary celebrated those with status and resources, because working women, even when successful, did not commission or receive statues. The absence being evidence that statuary preserved memory of privileged classes, that it excluded those who worked, that class intersected with gender in determining who was commemorated. Mary Beard reading absence as evidence, recognizing that silence about working women in statuary does not mean they were unimportant, but means they were excluded from forms of public memory that required resources, and that reflected elite values. The evidence for women must be sought elsewhere, must be sought in inscriptions that record women's names and relationships, must be sought in papyri that preserve contracts and letters, must be sought in archaeological remains that show women's living spaces and tools and possessions, must be sought by reading literary sources against grain for what they reveal about women despite not being focused on women, the seeking being Mary Beard's method. Being her recognition that recovering women's history from Roman world requires different sources and different methods than studying men's history requires attending to margins of sources, to what is mentioned in passing, to evidence that is fragmentary and indirect, the method being necessarily different because women were systematically excluded from forms of commemoration and record-keeping that preserve men's lives most fully. Because patriarchal society created historical record that privileged men's activities and marginalized women's. The statues that could not speak for women are testimony to patriarchy, are evidence not of women's unimportance but of their exclusion from public memory, not of their absence from Roman life but of their absence from forms of commemoration that we have inherited, not of their lack of significance, but of power structures that determined what was significant enough to preserve in marble, the testimony being clear when read critically. When analyzed for what statues reveal through their gender distribution, through their subjects, through their purposes, through their silences, Mary Beard reading statuary as evidence of gender ideology, of power structures, of how memory was shaped by patriarchy, of how recovering women's history requires attending to absences, to silences, to what is not shown, to what statuary could not speak about because women were excluded from forms of public commemoration that statuary represented. The statue's silence about women being eloquent testimony, being evidence that must be interpreted, being demonstration that critical history requires asking who is not represented, whose voices are not heard, whose lives are not commemorated, whose memory was not preserved in marble, the statues that could not speak for women being monuments not to women's absence but to patriarchy's power, not to history's limitations but to power's determinations of what was worth remembering. In Pompeii, where volcanic eruption froze moment in time, where Mount Vesuvius erupted on August 24, 79 CE, and buried city in ash and pumice that killed inhabitants but preserved their city, where excavations beginning in 18th century uncovered streets and houses and shops and temples remarkably intact, where walls that had stood for centuries beneath volcanic debris still bore marks that Romans made. Graffiti scrawled by hands that did not know they were writing for posterity, inscriptions carved by people who did not imagine that 2,000 years later scholars would read their words, messages that were meant to be ephemeral, meant to last days or weeks or months, meant for local audiences who would recognize references and understand contexts, but that became permanent through catastrophe, became archaeological evidence through disaster, became voices from past through preservation that no one intended. In Pompeii's excavated streets, Mary Beard finds evidence that official sources do not preserve, finds voices that literary texts do not record, finds testimony to how ordinary people lived, what they cared about, how they expressed themselves when they were not writing for formal audiences or for posterity, when they were not trying to impress or to preserve their reputations, but were simply writing messages on walls. The graffiti are diverse, are including political slogans supporting candidates for local office, are including insults directed at rivals or enemies, are including declarations of love written by people identifying themselves or anonymous, are including sexual boasts and descriptions, are including simple statements like "I was here," are including advertisements for services, are including prices and accounts, are including drawings accompanying text or standing alone, are including everything from sophisticated poetry to crude drawings to simple name writing, the diversity being testimony to writing's prevalence in Pompeii, to literacy spread beyond elite, to habit of writing on walls being common enough that walls throughout city bore layers of graffiti, the prevalence being different from what literary sources might suggest, being evidence that writing was more widespread, more casual, more embedded in daily life than studying only formal texts would indicate. The graffiti being testimony to popular literacy, to writing culture that extended beyond elite men who produced literature that survived in manuscript tradition. The political graffiti are supporting candidates for local offices, are urging election of particular men to positions of edile or duumvir, are sometimes identifying groups doing the supporting, are saying things like the goldsmiths support Gaius Julius Polybius for duumvir, are being campaign advertisements, are being endorsements visible to neighbors, are being testimony to how local politics worked, to how candidates sought support, to who participated in political process at local level. The graffiti being evidence that literary sources do not provide, being showing us how elections actually functioned in Roman towns, how different groups organized politically, how public walls were used for political communication, Mary Beard reading political graffiti as evidence of local political culture, of how different occupational groups participated, of how walls became media for political expression. Of democracies functioning at municipal level in ways that sources focused on imperial politics do not reveal. The love graffiti are declaring affection or desire, or saying things like "I love Romula," are sometimes being more explicit about sexual interests, are sometimes including drawings, are being expressions that people wanted to make public even if they did not attach names to them, are being testimony to emotional lives, to how people expressed feelings, to what they wanted to declare even when anonymously, the love declarations being evidence of culture, of how Romans thought about love and desire, of what was acceptable to write on public walls, of how private feelings could be made public through graffiti, Mary Beard reading love graffiti as evidence of emotional culture, of gender relations, of how different forms of love and desire were expressed, of what was considered worth declaring even when declaration was anonymous, the graffiti being windows into effective dimensions of Roman life that formal sources rarely discuss in ways that reveal how ordinary people experienced love. The insult graffiti are attacking individuals by name, are calling people thieves or adulterers or worse, are including crude sexual insults, are being expressions of conflicts and resentments, are being ways of attacking enemies publicly, are being testimony to social tensions, to how people used public writing to shame or attack others, to what kinds of accusations were considered effective insults, the insults being evidence of social norms because they violated them. Being revealing what behavior was considered shameful, what accusations had power to harm reputations, how public shaming worked, Mary Beard reading insults as evidence of values, of what was considered transgressive, of how social control operated through reputation and shame, of how graffiti could be used as weapon in social conflicts, the insults being testimony to society's underbelly, to conflicts that official sources do not record, to how ordinary people fought battles through words on walls. The sexual graffiti are explicit, are describing sexual acts in crude language, are boasting about conquests, are advertising services in ways that make clear what kind of services, are including drawings that are pornographic, are being testimony to sexual culture that literary sources discuss but discuss differently with different vocabulary for different purposes, the graffiti being evidence of how ordinary people talked about sex, what was considered worth boasting about. What could be written on public walls without apparent concern for propriety? Mary Beard reading sexual graffiti as evidence of sexual culture, of gender relations, of how power operated in sexual realm, of what the explicitness of public sexual graffiti reveals about Roman attitudes, about differences between public and private sexual discourse, about how sexual boasting functioned, the graffiti being evidence that is difficult, that is crude, that reveals aspects of Roman culture that are not always comfortable to contemplate, but that must be acknowledged if we are to understand culture completely. The gladiator graffiti are celebrating fighters, are naming gladiators who were popular, are describing their victories, are expressing admiration, are sometimes expressing erotic interest in gladiators, are being testimony to gladiatorial culture's importance, to how deeply spectacles of violence penetrated popular consciousness, to how gladiators were celebrities, to how people identified with them, fantasized about them, celebrated them. The gladiator graffiti being evidence of entertainment culture, of violence's appeal, of how spectacles shaped urban life. Mary Beard reading gladiator graffiti as evidence of culture that celebrated violence, that made celebrities of fighters, that eroticized gladiators, that reveals aspects of Roman values that are troubling, that shows appeal of brutal spectacles that were central to Roman urban culture. The simple presence graffiti are declaring, "I was here," are writing names on walls, are claiming space through inscription, are making mark that says, "I existed, I was in this place," are being perhaps most basic form of graffiti, most fundamental urge to leave trace, to be remembered even if only by unknown future wall readers. The presence graffiti being testimony to human desire to mark, to claim, to persist beyond moment. Mary Beard reading presence graffiti as evidence of consciousness, of desire to leave mark, of democratic impulse to write name alongside other names, to claim space that anyone could claim by writing on wall, the graffiti being testimony to writing's accessibility, to its use for most basic human expression of wanting to be remembered. The graffiti that whispered from walls are evidence that Mary Beard values, are evidence that comes from broader cross-section of society than literary sources do, are evidence that was not intended for preservation and therefore not shaped by concerns about reputation or posterity, are evidence that reveals what people wrote when they were not being formal, when they were expressing themselves casually, when they were participating in wall-writing culture that made public spaces into texts that anyone literate could contribute to. The graffiti being democracy of evidence, being voices that official history does not preserve, being testimony to ordinary lives that literary sources mention only in passing if at all. Mary Beard reading graffiti as precious evidence, as windows into Roman world that complement and complicate picture provided by literary texts, as testimony that must be read carefully but that reveals dimensions of Roman life that other sources cannot access. The walls preserving voices that whispered across centuries, that speak still to historians who listen, who value what graffiti reveal, who recognize that recovering past requires attending to casual inscriptions alongside formal monuments, to walls alongside manuscripts, to what ordinary people wrote alongside what elite authors composed. The graffiti that whispered from walls being testimony that Mary Beard hears, interprets, values, uses to construct understanding of Rome that includes voices beyond elite, beyond formal, beyond official. The whispers from walls being evidence of lives lived, of people who existed, of culture that was richer and more complex than sources focused on elite activities reveal. The graffiti being testament to democracy of writing, to accessibility of walls, to urge to mark, to declare, to express. To be remembered, the whispers being heard still, being read still, being valued by Mary Beard, who recognizes their importance, who uses them to recover voices, to understand culture, to see Rome more completely. In the historical sources that Romans left behind, in the manuscripts that medieval monks preserved, in the texts that Renaissance scholars edited and modern classicists study, there is pervasive silence about majority of Roman population, about the enslaved people who made Roman economy function, who built the monuments we admire, who served in households of elite whose lives are documented in sources, who worked in mines and on farms and in workshops, who constituted perhaps 1/3 of Italy's population during late Republic and early Empire, who were essential to everything Romans achieved, but who were rarely considered worthy of historical attention, who were mentioned in sources primarily when they posed threats through rebellions like Spartacus's uprising, or when they were property being discussed in legal contexts, or when famous Romans happened to mention their slaves in letters or speeches, but who were otherwise invisible in historical record, were absent from chronicles and histories and biographies that focused on political events and elite activities, were not counted as individuals who mattered, whose lives deserved documentation, whose experiences were significant enough to preserve for posterity. The silence being not accidental but being structural, being product of society that took slavery for granted as natural institution, that did not question it ethically, that saw enslaved people as property rather than as persons whose lives had historical significance. The silence being among most profound absences in Roman sources, being gap that makes recovering enslaved people's experiences enormously difficult, being testament to how power shapes historical record, to who gets remembered and who gets forgotten, to whose lives are considered worth documenting, and whose are treated as invisible background to stories about those who held power. Mary Beard confronts this silence, confronts it by acknowledging it, by recognizing that recovering enslaved people's history is difficult because sources are so limited, by being honest about what we cannot know, by resisting temptation to speak confidently about experiences that sources barely document, by working carefully with fragmentary evidence that does exist to recover what can be recovered while acknowledging how much remains unknowable, the confrontation being methodological challenge. Being requiring different approaches than studying elite Romans requires, being demanding attention to margins of sources, to what is mentioned incidentally, to material evidence from archaeology, to everything that might yield information despite sources' systematic exclusion of enslaved people's perspectives. Mary Beard's approach being characterized by humility about limits of knowledge, by honesty about silences, by commitment to recovering what can be recovered without pretending to know more than evidence supports. The legal sources discuss slavery extensively discuss it because enslaved people were property and law-regulated property, discuss rules for buying and selling slaves, for punishing slaves, for freeing slaves, for determining status of children born to enslaved women, for handling disputes involving slave ownership, the legal discussions being valuable evidence for understanding institutions functioning, for knowing what rules governed slavery, for seeing how Romans categorized and controlled enslaved people, but being limited evidence for understanding enslaved people's experiences, because legal texts show us law rather than life, show us what was supposed to happen rather than what actually happened, show us how elite male jurists thought about slavery rather than how enslaved people experienced it. Mary Beard using legal sources for what they reveal about institution, while recognizing they do not give us enslaved people's voices. Do not tell us how slavery felt to those subjected to it. Do not preserve perspectives of those whom law treated as objects rather than subjects. The literary sources mention slaves casually mention them as servants in households, as characters in plays and novels, as examples in philosophical discussions, as property in economic contexts, the casual mentions being revealing precisely because they are casual, because they show what Romans took for granted, what they did not think needed explanation, what seemed normal to them. Mary Beard reading casual mentions for what they reveal about assumptions, about how slavery was embedded in daily life, about how thoroughly slavery permeated Roman society, about how Romans thought about enslaved people, about relationships between enslaved and free that sources mention without analyzing because they were too ordinary to merit analysis, the casual evidence being valuable when read carefully, when analyzed for what it assumes, when interrogated for what it reveals inadvertently. The epitaphs of freed slaves survive in substantial numbers survive because freed slaves who achieved success often commissioned tombstones, often commemorated family members, often wanted to preserve memory of freedom achieved, the epitaphs being valuable evidence for understanding slavery's aftermath, for seeing how freed people constructed identities, how they used epitaphs to proclaim free status, how they maintained relationships with former owners or distanced themselves, how they built families after manumission, the epitaphs being testimony to lives of freed people rather than enslaved people but being relevant to slavery's history because they show what freedom meant to those who had been enslaved, what they valued about freedom, what they wanted to commemorate. Mary Beard using epitaphs of freed slaves as evidence for understanding slavery's impact, for seeing how people who experienced enslavement remembered it. for understanding trajectories from slavery to freedom. The archaeological evidence preserves what texts do not preserve: spaces where enslaved people lived, tools they used, chains that restrained them, graffiti they wrote, objects they owned or made, evidence of their labor, traces of their presence in households and workshops and rural estates, the material evidence being essential for recovering aspects of enslaved people's lives that sources do not document, being showing us physical conditions, living spaces, work environments, material culture. Everything that archaeology can reveal when combined with careful interpretation. Mary Beard valuing archaeological evidence as complement to limited textual sources, using material remains to understand aspects of slavery that texts ignore, recognizing that recovering enslaved people's history requires using every source available, every fragment of evidence, everything that might illuminate lives that official memory forgot. The slave rebellions that sources do discuss are revealing Roman fears, are revealing that Romans feared enslaved people, feared their potential for resistance, feared uprisings that could threaten order, the fear being visible in how sources describe rebellions, in emphasis on violence, in need to explain how rebellions were suppressed, in lessons drawn about necessity of controlling enslaved population. The sources about rebellions being evidence of enslavers' perspectives rather than enslaved people's perspectives, but being valuable for what they reveal about power relations, about violence that maintained system, about resistance that enslaved people offered, about fact that slavery required constant coercion, because enslaved people did not accept their enslavement willingly. Mary Beard reading accounts of rebellions for what they reveal about both sides. About enslaved people's resistance, and about slaveholders' violence and fear. The silence where slaves are not counted is profound, is gap in historical record that cannot be completely filled, is absence that must be acknowledged even while attempting to recover what can be recovered, is testimony to how power shapes memory, to whose lives are preserved and whose are forgotten, to systematic exclusion of enslaved people from forms of commemoration and documentation that preserve other Romans' lives more fully, the silence being evidence itself. Being showing us how slavery functioned to dehumanize, to treat people as property, to deny their significance as individuals, to exclude them from historical memory. Mary Beard's response being to acknowledge silence while working to hear what whispers survive, to recognize limits while pushing against them, to admit what we cannot know while recovering what we can, to make visible through careful analysis the people whom Roman sources tried to render invisible, to count those who were not counted. To give weight to lives that sources treated as weightless, to practice history that attends to absences, that reads silences, that recognizes that recovering past of powerless requires different methods than studying powerful requires, that makes central those whom sources marginalized, the silence where slaves are not counted being challenged that Mary Beard confronts through methodological sophistication, through careful reading, through attending to fragments. Through building understanding from limited evidence while acknowledging limitations, through refusing to accept sources' silences as final, through insisting that enslaved people's history matters even when sources did not think it mattered, through practicing history that is attentive to power, to how power shaped what was recorded and what was forgotten, to whose voices survive and whose do not, to who counted and who was not counted, the silence being profound but not being absolute. Being challengeable through careful work, through attending to everything that might reveal what sources tried to hide, what power tried to forget, what official memory excluded, the silence where slaves are not counted being testimony to slavery's brutality, to its denial of humanity, to its exclusion of enslaved people from memory as it excluded them from freedom, but being also challenged to historians who refuse to accept silence, who work to recover voices, who insist on counting those who were not counted, who practice history that makes visible those whom power tried to render invisible. In descriptions of Roman banquets that survive in literary sources, in Petronius's fictional account of Trimalchio's ostentatious feast in the Satyricon, In Pliny the Younger's letters describing dinners he attended or hosted, in cookbook attributed to Apicius that preserves recipes for elaborate dishes, in archaeological remains of dining rooms decorated with frescoes showing food and drink. In physical evidence of what Romans ate recovered from drains and garbage deposits and preserved remains, Mary Beard sees not just menus but social structures, not just recipes but power relations, not just meals but culture, sees that food was never simply sustenance in Roman world but was always also performance, was display, was communication, was way of showing status and wealth, was mechanism for creating and maintaining relationships, was expression of values and tastes and identities, the banquet being site where all these dimensions converged, where elite Romans entertained guests, displayed resources, demonstrated cultivation, performed hospitality, negotiated social relationships, conducted business, exchanged gossip, formed alliances, maintained networks, the banquet being much more than meal, being social institution that reveals when examined carefully how Roman society organized itself, how hierarchies operated, how consumption demonstrated status, how food told stories about empire and trade and agriculture and labor and values and everything that made Rome what it was. The reclining posture was significant, was Romans reclining on couches to eat rather than sitting at tables, the posture being distinctively Roman, being mark of civilization in Roman view, being contrasting with how conquered peoples ate, the reclining being comfortable for those accustomed to it but being also statement about leisure, about having time and space to recline, about not needing to eat quickly or efficiently, but being able to linger over meal in relaxed posture. The posture being mark of free status because slaves served but did not recline, stood to serve those who reclined, the reclining being gendered because women's participation in banquets was controversial, respectable women sometimes not reclining or not attending. The posture telling stories about status, about gender, about Roman identity, about what it meant to be civilized in Roman terms. Mary Beard reading reclining posture as evidence of values, of how Romans distinguished themselves from others, of how they performed status through how they positioned their bodies at meals. The order of courses mattered that banquets followed structure with appetizers, main courses, desserts, that courses succeeded each other according to plan, that variety was displayed through multiplicity of dishes, that progression created narrative arc for meal, the structure being opportunity to demonstrate wealth through abundance, to show knowledge through selecting appropriate dishes for each course, to display sophistication through complexity of preparations. The order being convention that had to be followed to show competence as host, the structure telling stories about resources available, about concern with propriety and tradition, about how meals were understood as organized wholes rather than as random successions of dishes. Mary Beard reading order of courses as evidence of cultural values, of concern with structure and propriety, of how meals were performed according to scripts that everyone recognized. The exotic foods demonstrated empire, demonstrated through including ingredients from across Mediterranean and beyond, through serving foods that required extensive trade networks to obtain, through displaying spices from India and Arabia, garum fish sauce from Spain, wines from various regions, fruits and vegetables from different provinces, the variety being testimony to trade networks that brought goods to Rome, to agricultural systems in provinces that supplied capital's demand. To fact that Roman elite could consume products of empire, that their tables demonstrated empire's extent, the exotic foods telling stories about conquest, about trade, about how empire functioned to bring resources from periphery to center, about how Roman consumption depended on provincial production. Mary Beard reading exotic ingredients as evidence of empire's economic structures, of trade networks, of how conquest translated into consumption, of material benefits that empire brought to Roman elite. The labor that made banquets possible was invisible, was labor of enslaved people who grew food, transported it, prepared it, cooked it, served it, cleaned up afterward, the invisibility being structural, being sources focusing on guests and dishes rather than on workers, being taking labor for granted, being not acknowledging that elaborate meals required enormous work by people who were not free, who did not benefit from meals they prepared, who served food they did not eat. The invisibility in sources being testimony to how slavery functioned, to how enslaved people's labor was essential but unacknowledged, to how their work made elite lifestyle possible but was not considered worth commenting on. Mary Beard making visible what sources obscure, acknowledging labor that sources ignore, recognizing that understanding Roman banquets requires thinking about not just those who reclined, but also those who served, not just consumption but also production. Not just display, but also work that made display possible. The conversation at banquets was important, was part of entertainment, was opportunity for wit and learning to be displayed, was context for philosophical discussion and literary recitation and political gossip, was being recorded in sources that preserve what was said or what authors imagined might have been said, the conversation being evidence of intellectual culture, of what topics interested elite, of how they entertained each other verbally, of what constituted good conversation. Of how wit was valued, the conversation telling stories about values, about education, about what knowledge mattered, about how Romans performed intellectually at dinners. Mary Beard reading accounts of dinner conversation as evidence of culture, of intellectual interests, of how elite Romans understood themselves, of what they valued in discourse. The seating arrangements encoded hierarchy encoded through where each guest reclined, through proximity to host, through better or worse positions on couches, through who was placed next to whom, the arrangements being carefully planned to reflect status, to honor important guests, to avoid giving offense, to communicate through spatial positioning what words might not say, the seating being language that guests could read, that told them how host valued them, how their status compared to others. Where they stood in social networks, the arrangements telling stories about relationships, about hierarchies, about how status was negotiated and displayed. Mary Beard reading seating arrangements as evidence of social structures, of how relationships were managed, of how seemingly small details like where someone reclined carried significant meaning in culture attentive to such signals. The banquet where food tells stories is site that Mary Beard analyzes for what it reveals about social structures through who attended and who served, about power through who hosted and who was invited, about empire through what foods were served, about labor through what work made banquets possible, about culture through how meals were structured and consumed, about values through what was considered appropriate and impressive, about gender through women's exclusion or limited participation. About status through seating and courses and conversation, the analysis being reading banquet as text, as performance, as evidence of everything that made Roman society what it was, the food telling stories that Mary Beard recovers, interprets, uses to understand culture, to see how Romans organized themselves, to recognize how consumption was performance, how meals were political and social events, how what people ate and how they ate it reveals values and structures and relationships. The banquet being much more than meal, being institution that when examined carefully yields insights into Roman world, into how it functioned, into what it valued, into how it maintained hierarchies and displayed wealth and performed status. The food telling stories that Mary Beard teaches us to read, to interpret, to understand as evidence of culture and society and power. In Pompeii's excavated remains, in building that archaeologists identified as brothel based on small rooms, stone beds, erotic frescoes on walls, graffiti left by visitors, Mary Beard confronts space where sex work occurred in Roman world, where services were sold that respectable sources rarely discussed directly, where activity that Roman men participated in was conducted in building that survives as material evidence even when literary sources are silent or euphemistic about such places, the brothel being testimony to aspect of Roman life that texts do not much document, that respectable authors did not consider appropriate subject for extended discussion, that was part of urban life but was not part of official history. The building preserving through its architecture and decoration and graffiti evidence that words do not preserve. The walls being silent about women who worked there, about their names and lives and experiences, but walls being nevertheless testimony, being evidence that must be interpreted carefully, that reveals through physical spaces and images and inscriptions how sex work functioned, how it was organized spatially, how it was represented visually, how it was discussed by those who visited. The silence about workers being profound, being gap that cannot be completely filled, being testimony to whose voices survive and whose do not, to whose experiences are documented and whose are forgotten. The building's layout reveals organization, reveals small rooms arranged along corridor, reveals stone beds built into rooms, reveals that spaces were minimal, were not designed for comfort or privacy beyond minimal requirements, were functional spaces for transactions, the layout being evidence of how sex work was organized, of conditions under which it occurred, of how workers and customers used space, of values embedded in architecture that provided minimal accommodations. Mary Beard reading layout as evidence of commodification, of how sex was sold in spaces that reduced interaction to transaction, that provided no more than necessary for function, that treated activity as commercial exchange requiring minimal space and amenities. The layout telling stories about how Roman society organized activity it participated in but did not celebrate, how it created spaces for sex work that were functional rather than luxurious, that served purposes without pretending activity was anything other than commercial. The frescoes are explicit, are depicting sexual acts in ways that leave nothing to imagination, are showing positions and activities, are being decorations that modern viewers find pornographic but that Romans apparently considered appropriate for walls of such establishment, the explicitness being testimony to different attitudes about sexual imagery, about what was acceptable to depict, about how sex was represented visually, the frescoes being evidence that must be interpreted carefully. That might have served as advertisements or as instructions or as entertainment or as all of these, that reveals Roman comfort with explicit sexual imagery in contexts where such imagery seemed appropriate. Mary Beard analyzing frescoes not with modern embarrassment, but with historians' attention to what they reveal about culture, about sexual practices, about visual culture, about how sex was depicted and discussed and understood in culture that had different boundaries about what was appropriate than modern Western culture has. The graffiti left by visitors' record presences record men's names, record boasts about encounters, record evaluations of workers, record prices paid, record sexual acts performed, the graffiti being testimony that survives when other documentation does not, being evidence from customers rather than workers, but being valuable nevertheless for what it reveals about how brothel functioned, about who visited, about what they wanted to commemorate, about how they talked about experiences. The graffiti being casual evidence, being not intended for historical preservation, but being preserved through accident of volcanic burial, Mary Beard reading graffiti as evidence of sexual culture, of how men discussed sex work, of what they considered worth recording on walls, of language used, of attitudes revealed through boasts and evaluations, the graffiti being problematic evidence because it comes from customers' perspectives, because it treats workers as objects of evaluation rather than as subjects, but being valuable nonetheless for what it reveals about culture, about trade, about how sex work was discussed by participants. The silence about workers is almost total, is absence of their names except in graffiti that records them for commercial purposes, is absence of their voices, is absence of their perspectives on work they did, is absence that reflects their status as enslaved or freed women without resources to create records, without power to control how they were remembered, without access to forms of commemoration that preserve elite women's names, the silence being structural, being product of power relations, being testimony to how thoroughly sex workers were excluded from historical memory, how completely their experiences were not considered worth documenting. Mary Beard acknowledging silence, acknowledging that we cannot recover what sources did not preserve, acknowledging that sex workers' perspectives are almost entirely lost, that what we can know is limited to what material remains and customers' graffiti reveal, the acknowledgement being honest recognition of sources' limits, of gaps that cannot be filled, of voices that cannot be recovered from past that did not value them enough to preserve them. The legal status of sex workers was uncertain, with some being enslaved, forced into work by owners, having no choice, some being freed women working independently or under someone else's management, having limited options, legal sources discussing sex work in context of regulation and taxation but not preserving workers' perspectives, not treating them as subjects whose experiences mattered, the legal evidence being about control and revenue rather than about people. Mary Beard using legal sources for what they reveal about regulation while recognizing they do not give us workers' voices, do not tell us how women experienced work, do not preserve perspectives of those subjected to regulation, the legal evidence being valuable but limited, being showing us law rather than life, being revealing how Roman state regulated activity without revealing how those regulated experienced regulation. The archaeological interpretation is debated, is not certain that building identified as brothel was actually brothel, is possible it was something else, is interpretation based on architecture and decoration and graffiti, but interpretation nevertheless, the uncertainty being reminder that archaeology requires interpretation, that physical remains do not speak for themselves, that what we think we know about spaces is based on inference from evidence that is ambiguous. Mary Beard acknowledging uncertainty while working with what evidence suggests, being honest about interpretive nature of archaeological claims, being recognizing that even when we have material remains we are still interpreting, still constructing understanding from evidence that does not announce its meaning unambiguously. The brothel where walls preserve silence is space that Mary Beard examines as evidence of Roman life, examines for what architecture reveals about organization of sex work, for what frescoes reveal about sexual culture, for what graffiti reveals about customers and language and attitudes, for what legal sources reveal about regulation, for what silence reveals about power, about whose voices survive and whose do not, about whose experiences are documented and whose are forgotten. The examination being careful, being acknowledging limits, being recognizing that much cannot be known, that workers' voices are almost entirely absent, that what we can say is based on fragmentary evidence from material remains and from sources created by customers and regulators rather than by workers themselves. Mary Beard's approach being characterized by honesty about silence, by acknowledgement of gaps, by resistance to speaking confidently about what sources do not preserve. By careful work with evidence that exists while acknowledging evidence that does not exist, by attention to what walls preserve even when what they preserve is silence about those who worked within them, the brothel being evidence of aspect of Roman life that texts do not much document, being material testimony that survives when textual testimony does not. Being space that reveals through its physical remains and through graffiti on its walls how sex work functioned while remaining silent about workers who performed it. The walls preserving silence that Mary Beard acknowledges, interprets, uses as evidence of power relations, of whose voices matter and whose do not, of whose experiences are preserved and whose are forgotten, the silence being testimony itself, being evidence that must be read. Being gap that shows us limits of what we can recover from past that did not value everyone equally, that did not preserve everyone's voices, that left us with evidence that is partial, that is shaped by power, that excludes more than it includes. Roman theaters where stone seats still rise in semicircles facing stages where performances occurred 2,000 years ago, where audiences gathered to watch comedies and tragedies adapted from Greek originals or written by Roman playwrights like Plautus and Terence and Seneca, where actors wore masks that identified characters through conventional features, where performances were public events subsidized by magistrates seeking popularity, where theater was entertainment but was also political, was also social commentary, was also cultural expression that reveals when examined carefully how Romans thought about themselves, about proper behavior and transgression, about social norms and their violation, about power and its abuse, about gender and class and morality and everything that comedies exaggerated and tragedies explored. Mary Beard sees theater as historical source, sees plays as evidence of culture, sees performances as testimony to values and anxieties, sees masks as paradoxical devices that hid truth, in one sense hid actors' actual faces, created distance between performer and character, made performances into obvious fictions, but that revealed truth in another sense, revealed through exaggeration what society valued and feared, revealed through comic inversion what norms existed, revealed through tragic exploration what limits were. The theater where masks hid truth being space where truth could be examined precisely, because masks made clear that what was shown was not real, was performance, was fiction that could explore what realistic representation could not. The masks were conventional, were indicating through features and colors what type of character was being portrayed, were signaling old man or young lover, clever slave or stern father, cunning courtesan or respectable wife, were using conventions that audiences recognized, that allowed immediate identification of character types, that made clear what role each masked actor played, the conventionality being testimony to shared cultural understanding, to agreement about types that existed in society, to categories that Romans recognized. Mary Beard reading masks as evidence of social types, of how Romans categorized people, of stereotypes that existed, of how theater reduced complexity of actual people to recognizable types that could be deployed in plots, that could interact in predictable ways, that could be used to explore social dynamics through simplified characters, the masks being evidence of typology, of how Romans thought about social roles, about categories of persons who inhabited their world. The comedies explored inversions, explored scenarios where slaves were cleverer than masters, where young lovers outwitted stern fathers, where women manipulated men, where social hierarchies were temporarily reversed through plot devices that resolved in ways that restored order, but that allowed exploration of what inversion might mean, what freedom might look like, what it might feel like to have power when normally one did not, the inversions being safe because they were temporary. Because everyone knew order would be restored by play's end, because fiction allowed exploration that reality did not. Mary Beard reading comedies as evidence of social tensions, of desires to transgress norms, of fantasies about different arrangements, of anxieties about hierarchy's fragility, the inversions revealing through their temporary nature both appeal of different arrangements and commitment to maintaining actual hierarchies, both pleasure in imagining transgression and relief at restoration of order. The tragedies explored limits, explored what happened when people violated fundamental norms, when they committed terrible crimes, when they faced impossible choices, when gods punished humans, when families destroyed themselves, when ambition led to catastrophe, the explorations being moral investigations, being examinations of what humans were capable of for good and evil, being contemplations of suffering and responsibility and fate and free will. The tragedies being evidence of how Romans thought about morality, about limits, about what should not be done, about consequences that followed violations. Mary Beard reading tragedies as evidence of ethical thinking, of concerns about proper behavior, of recognition that humans could commit terrible acts, of wrestling with questions about responsibility and punishment and justice. The tragedies revealing culture's serious side, its capacity for moral reflection, its engagement with difficult questions about human nature and right action. The gender roles were exaggerated, were showing women as either virtuous and submissive or as scheming and dangerous, were showing men as either honorable and strong or as weak and foolish, were reducing gender complexity to stereotypes that served dramatic purposes, that created characters who could drive plots, that embodied cultural ideals and anxieties, the exaggeration being conventional, being what audiences expected, being how theater worked with types rather than with psychologically complex individuals, Mary Beard reading gender representations as evidence of ideals, of anxieties, of how Romans thought women and men should behave and how they feared they might behave, of double standards that applied different moral evaluations to same behaviors depending on gender, the exaggerated gender roles being testimony to patriarchal values, to expectations that constrained women, to models of masculinity that men were supposed to embody. The slaves in comedies were stock characters, were often being clever tricksters who outwitted masters, were speaking truths that free characters could not speak, were driving plots through schemes and manipulations, were being rewarded with freedom by play's ends, the slave characters being fantasy, being inversion of reality where enslaved people were property without power, the fantasy being safe because it was contained within fiction, because everyone knew real slaves did not have power that comic slaves had. Because plays' resolutions often involved slaves being freed, which removed threat of continuing inversion. Mary Beard reading slave characters as evidence of anxieties about slavery, of recognition that slaves were intelligent humans who might resent enslavement, of need to manage tensions through fictional outlets that allowed exploration of what enslaved people's cleverness might mean, while containing it within fiction that did not threaten actual power structures. The political commentary was indirect, was not attacking current rulers by name, but was exploring themes of tyranny and justice and proper use of power, was using historical or mythological settings to examine questions that had contemporary relevance, was employing allegory and allusion that audiences could interpret, was commentary that had to be careful because criticizing powerful was dangerous, but that could occur through indirection that theater enabled. Mary Beard reading plays for political content, for how they explored power, for how they commented on contemporary issues through displaced settings, for how theater provided space for critique that had to be veiled, that could not be direct, that worked through metaphor and allusion, the indirect commentary being evidence of how culture negotiated between expression and censorship, between desire to comment and danger of offending. The audiences were diverse, were including elite who sat in better seats and poor who sat higher up, were including men and women though gender mixing was controversial, were including all who could afford admission or who attended when magistrates provided free performances, were being mixed crowds who watched together, who responded together, who participated in collective experience that theater provided, the diversity being evidence of theater's public character. Of how performances created moments when different social groups shared space and experience, when divisions were temporarily less important than shared spectatorship. Mary Beard reading audience composition as evidence of urban culture, of public life, of how entertainment created community even when community was hierarchically organized, even when seating reflected status. The theater where masks hid truth was space where Romans examined themselves, examined through fiction, through performance, through exaggeration, through types and inversions and explorations of limits, the examination being possible because masks made clear that what was shown was not real, that actors were not characters they portrayed, that performances were fictions that could therefore explore what realistic representation could not. Mary Beard reading theater as evidence of culture. Reading plays as testimony to values and anxieties, reading performances as explorations of social norms and their transgression, reading masks as devices that paradoxically enabled truth-telling through acknowledged fiction, the theater being institution that reveals when examined how Romans entertained themselves, but also how they thought about society, about proper behavior, about gender and class and power and morality, about everything that mattered to them. The masks hiding truth about actors' identities while revealing truth about culture's concerns. The theater where masks hid truth being paradoxically place where truths could be explored, could be performed, could be witnessed, could be contemplated. The truth being not factual truth about events but being cultural truth about values and fears and desires and norms. The theater being evidence that Mary Beard values, that she reads carefully, that she interprets as window into Roman culture. Into how Romans understood themselves, into what they celebrated and what they feared, into what norms they maintained and what inversions they fantasized about, into what limits they recognized and what transgressions they contemplated, the theater being testament to culture's complexity, to its capacity for self-examination, to its use of fiction to explore truth, to its employment of masks to reveal what faces could not show. The theater where masks hid truth being place where truth was nevertheless revealed, where culture examined itself, where Romans watched themselves being represented, being exaggerated, being explored, being performed, the masks hiding and revealing simultaneously, the theater being evidence that Mary Beard reads to understand culture, to see values, to recognize anxieties, to comprehend how Romans thought about themselves and their world. In the aqueducts that brought water to Rome from distant sources, that crossed valleys on arches still standing after 2 millennia, that stretched for miles through countryside and into city, that supplied fountains and baths and private households with water that made urban life possible at scale that Rome achieved, that were engineering marvels celebrated in their own time and admired ever since, that demonstrated Roman technical capability and organizational capacity. Mary Beard sees not just infrastructure but ideology, not just engineering but empire, not just practical necessity but political statement, sees that aqueducts carried more than water carried messages about Roman power, about states' capacity to organize massive projects, about empire's ability to transform landscapes, about civilization's triumph over nature, about why Roman rule was justified by capabilities that subject peoples lacked. The aqueducts being monuments as much as utilities, being propaganda as much as infrastructure, being designed to impress as well as to function, being visible demonstrations of what Rome could achieve, of how Roman engineering surpassed others, of how empire brought benefits that justified conquest, the water flowing through channels but ideology flowing through them too, the infrastructure being never neutral but being always political. Being serving practical purposes but also serving to demonstrate power, to inspire awe, to make visible empires' reach and organization and transformative capacity. The engineering was sophisticated, was requiring surveying to determine gradients, calculating to ensure water flowed at correct speed, designing to maintain channels across varying terrain, constructing arches to cross valleys without losing elevation, building reservoirs to store water, installing distribution systems to deliver water throughout city, maintaining infrastructure to keep it functioning, the sophistication being real, being achievement worthy of admiration. Being testimony to Roman technical knowledge and practical skill, Mary Beard acknowledging engineering achievement while also examining what achievement meant beyond technical realm, while recognizing that infrastructure was also statement, was also demonstration of power, was also serving purposes beyond delivering water, the engineering being both genuinely impressive and also being deployed for political purposes, being both practical achievement and ideological statement. The visibility was deliberate, was aqueducts being designed to be seen, being built with arches that were taller than strictly necessary, being constructed with attention to appearance as well as function, being monuments that dominated landscapes that were visible from distances, that proclaimed Roman presence, that could not be ignored or overlooked, the visibility being propaganda, being statement that said Rome built this, Rome controls this landscape. Rome has power to construct monuments that transform environment, Mary Beard reading visibility as evidence of political purposes, of how infrastructure was designed to communicate messages, to impress viewers, to demonstrate capabilities, to make power visible through permanent constructions that would endure as testimonies to Roman achievement, the visibility being intentional, being part of aqueducts' purposes. Being reason they were built as they were rather than being constructed in less visible ways that might have been equally functional. The inscriptions on aqueducts recorded builders, recorded emperors who commissioned construction, engineers who designed them, dates when they were built, the inscriptions being claims to credit, being statements about who deserved recognition for achievement, being typically crediting emperors rather than workers who actually built aqueducts, the inscriptions being evidence of how credit was assigned, of how achievements were attributed to powerful rather than to laborers, of how infrastructure became associated with rulers who commissioned it rather than with those who constructed it. Mary Beard reading inscriptions as evidence of power relations, of how emperors used infrastructure projects to enhance reputations, to demonstrate beneficence, to claim credit for improvements that workers created, but that emperors paid for and received recognition for. The water distribution was unequal, with some water going to public fountains available to everyone, some going to baths, some going to private households of wealthy who could afford connections. The distribution being reflecting hierarchies, being showing that even universal goods like water were distributed unequally, that access depended on status and resources, that infrastructure served elite interests even while also providing public benefits. Mary Beard reading distribution patterns as evidence of social structures, of how benefits were allocated, of how even infrastructure that served everyone served some better than others, of how inequality was built into systems that appeared universal, the water flowing to all but flowing unequally, flowing more reliably and more abundantly to those with resources and connections. The maintenance required labor required constant work to keep channels clear, to repair damage, to prevent leaks, to ensure water flowed. The labor being performed by enslaved people and by workers whose names are not recorded, whose work made aqueducts function but who received no credit, whose labor was essential but invisible in sources that celebrated emperors and engineers. Mary Beard making visible the labor that sources obscure, acknowledging that infrastructure required work, that maintenance was constant necessity, that enslaved people's labor made possible the flowing water that seemed to arrive effortlessly, the labor being hidden dimension of infrastructure, being work that sources take for granted, that Mary Beard insists on recognizing as essential to aqueducts' functioning. The celebration in sources emphasized benefits, emphasized how aqueducts brought water that improved public health, that enabled bathing culture, that supported population growth, that made Rome into great city, the emphasis being on positive consequences, being on how infrastructure benefited Romans, being on civilization that water made possible. Mary Beard acknowledging benefits while also examining costs, while recognizing that construction required resources extracted from provinces. Labor performed by enslaved people, organization that served empire's interests, the benefits being real but being purchased at costs that celebration did not acknowledge, that sources minimized, that traditional interpretations have often overlooked. Mary Beard's reading being more complex than simply celebrating achievement, being recognizing both benefits and costs, both impressiveness and exploitation. The aqueduct served empire served by demonstrating capabilities that justified rule, by providing infrastructure that made capital function, by bringing resources from periphery to center, by showing subject peoples what Rome could achieve, by being monuments to power that could be seen across landscape, by carrying water but also carrying messages about empire's beneficence and power and permanence, the service being both practical and ideological, being both functional and symbolic. Being infrastructure that worked but that also meant, that delivered water but that also delivered propaganda. Mary Beard reading aqueducts as serving empire in multiple ways, as being tools of power that were physical and ideological simultaneously, that shaped landscapes and shaped minds, that brought water and brought messages about why Roman rule was justified, was beneficial, was permanent. The aqueduct that carried more than water was infrastructure that Mary Beard critically examines for what it reveals about power, about how engineering was deployed for political purposes, about how infrastructure was designed to impress as well as function, about how achievement was credited to emperors rather than workers, about how benefits were distributed unequally, about how maintenance required invisible labor, about how celebration emphasized positives while minimizing costs, about how aqueducts served empire by demonstrating capabilities and providing benefits and making visible power's permanence, the examination being reading infrastructure politically, being recognizing that nothing Rome built was neutral, that everything served purposes beyond immediate functions, that aqueducts were monuments to power as much as they were utilities, that water flowed through channels but ideology flowed with it. That understanding aqueducts requires examining not just engineering but politics, not just function but meaning, not just what they did but what they meant. The aqueduct carrying more than water, carrying messages about empire, carrying demonstrations of power, carrying justifications for rule, carrying ideology along with practical necessity. The infrastructure being political, being serving empire's interests, being testimony to how power works through construction, through visibility. Through benefits distributed, through monuments that endure, the aqueduct that carried more than water being evidence that Mary Beard reads for what it reveals about power, about empire, about how Rome used infrastructure to demonstrate capabilities, to justify rule, to make visible its power, to transform landscapes, to bring resources from margins to center, to serve purposes that were practical and political simultaneously, the water flowing but meaning flowing with it. The aqueduct carrying more than water, forever carrying, forever demonstrating, forever being monument to power that calls water, but that meant empire. In inscriptions on tombstones that survive from across Roman Empire, in epitaphs carved into marble and limestone that were meant to preserve memory of dead, in texts that follow formulas but that sometimes break formulas to express particular griefs, in monuments ranging from elaborate sarcophagi of wealthy to simple stones of modest families, in words that survive when bodies have long since returned to dust, Mary Beard finds voices speaking across centuries about loss, about love, about grief, about what mattered to those left behind, finds evidence of lives lived and relationships cherished and deaths mourned, finds humanity that official histories focused on political events and military campaigns do not preserve, finds personal voices that speak about individual experiences rather than about collective achievements, finds testimony to emotions that formal sources do not record, the tombstones being windows into private lives, into families, into what people valued enough to commemorate in permanent materials, into how they wanted to be remembered and how they wanted to remember those they loved, the inscriptions being evidence of culture but also being evidence of individuals, being preserving names and ages and relationships, and sometimes brief statements about character or accomplishments, being monuments to ordinary people whose lives were significant to those who knew them, even if they were not significant to larger history. The tombstones recording what was lost in death, but preserving something through commemoration, through inscription, through will to remember. The epitaphs follow formulas, follow conventional phrases like "here lies," follow standard information about name and age and family relationships, follow patterns that made inscriptions recognizable as epitaphs, that signaled immediately what kind of monument this was, that used language everyone understood, the formulas being evidence of conventions, of shared cultural understanding about how dead should be commemorated, of what information mattered, of what should be preserved for posterity. Mary Beard reading formulas as evidence of values, of what culture considered important to record about individuals, of how people were defined through relationships and ages and sometimes occupations, the formulas being revealing through what they included and what they excluded, through what they assumed everyone would want to know about deceased, through patterns that were repeated across empire with local variations. The deviations from formulas are revealing are moments when standard language is broken to add personal touch, to express particular grief, to record specific quality of deceased, to say something that formula does not say, the deviations being precious because they show individuals breaking through conventions, because they preserve voices that sound personal rather than formulaic, because they express feelings that cannot be contained in standard phrases. Mary Beard reading deviations for what they reveal about relationships, about emotions, about what survivors wanted to express, about how inadequate formulas sometimes were for capturing particular losses, the deviations being evidence of humanity asserting itself against conventions, of people wanting to say more than formulas aloud, of love or grief or pride finding expression in additions to standard texts. The ages recorded tell demographic stories, tell about mortality patterns, about how many died young, about life expectancies, about when death came for different age groups, about family structures that included many children because many children died, the ages being evidence that can be aggregated to understand population patterns, to see how frequently infants and children died, how common it was to die in 20s or 30s, how rare it was to reach old age. Mary Beard using ages recorded on tombstones as demographic evidence, as data about mortality that can be analyzed statistically, as information that reveals patterns across many epitaphs even while each epitaph commemorates individual death, the ages being both personal information about individual who died and collective evidence about population patterns. The relationships commemorated reveal social structures, reveal who commemorated whom, reveal that husbands commemorated wives and wives commemorated husbands, reveal that parents commemorated children and sometimes children commemorated parents, reveal that freed slaves commemorated former owners and patrons commemorated freed slaves, reveal that relationships that mattered included family and also included bonds created by slavery and manumission. Mary Beard reading relationship patterns as evidence of social structures, of how families were organized, of how different kinds of bonds were recognized, of who had resources to commission tombstones, of whose deaths were considered worth commemorating permanently, the relationships being evidence of culture, of values, of what connections mattered enough to preserve in stone. The women commemorated were usually defined relationally, were identified as wife of, mother of, daughter of, were defined through relationships to men rather than through independent identities or achievements, were being commemorated for being good wives or devoted mothers rather than for accomplishments in public spheres. The relational identification being evidence of patriarchy, of how women were understood primarily through family roles, of how their significance was attached to men. Mary Beard reading relational epithets as evidence of gender ideology, of limitations on how women could be publicly acknowledged, of how even in death women were defined through relationships rather than through independent achievements, the pattern being testimony to how thoroughly patriarchal values shaped commemoration, shaped memory, shaped whose identities could be acknowledged and how. The children's tombstones are heartbreaking, are recording deaths of infants and young children, are expressing parents' grief in words that survive across centuries, are saying things like "to sweetest daughter" or "taken too soon," are being monuments to losses that were common in world of high infant mortality, but that were no less painful for being common. The children's epitaphs being testimony to griefs that official histories do not record, to private sorrows that were universal experiences. To love for children that death could not erase even if it could end lives, Mary Beard reading children's tombstones as evidence of emotional lives, of parent-child bonds, of how loss was expressed, of how grief found words even when words were inadequate to express depth of feeling, the epitaphs being testimony to humanity's capacity for love and for suffering. The freed slaves' tombstones are documenting transitions, are recording names that include reference to former owners, are sometimes including reference to freedom achieved, are being monuments that freed people commissioned to commemorate their own lives or lives of family members, are evidence of how freed people constructed identities, how they remembered enslavement or tried to move beyond it, how they used tombstones to proclaim free status. Mary Beard reading freed slaves' epitaphs as evidence of post-slavery experiences, of how people who had been enslaved constructed lives after manumission, of how freedom was valued and proclaimed, of how freed people related to past in bondage, of how they wanted to be remembered, the epitaphs being testimony to transitions from slavery to freedom, to lives that began in one status and ended in another. The occupations sometimes recorded tell economic stories, tell what work people did, what trades they practiced, what economic niches they filled, the occupations being evidence of urban economy, of diversity of work, of how people supported themselves, of pride in crafts and professions that led them to include occupations in epitaphs. Mary Beard reading occupational information as evidence of economic structures, of work that people did, of identities constructed through labor, of how people wanted to be remembered not just as family members, but as workers who contributed, who practiced trades, who had occupational identities worth commemorating. The tombstone that records what was lost is monument that Mary Beard reads for multiple purposes, reads for demographic information about ages and mortality, reads for evidence of social structures through relationships recorded, reads for gender ideology through how women are identified, reads for emotional culture through expressions of grief, reads for evidence of slavery and freedom, reads for economic information through occupations. Reads for everything that epitaphs preserve about lives lived and deaths mourned and memories cherished, the tombstones being windows into past that preserve voices speaking about personal experiences, about loves and losses, about what mattered to individuals even when individuals were not historically significant in ways that political histories recognize. The tombstones recording what was lost, recording lives ended, relationships severed. Futures foreclosed, but preserving something through commemoration, through inscription, through determination to remember, through will to make permanent in stone what death had made impermanent in flesh. The tombstones being testimony that Mary Beard values, that she reads carefully, that she interprets as evidence of human experiences that official histories do not preserve, that she uses to recover emotional lives, social structures, demographic patterns, economic realities, gender ideologies. All dimensions of Roman life that survive in epitaphs, the tombstone recording what was lost but preserving what was loved, preserving names and ages and relationships, preserving grief and pride and determination to remember, preserving humanity across centuries, preserving voices that speak still to historians who listen, who read inscriptions not just as information but as testimony to lives lived, to losses suffered, to love that survived death through commemoration. The tombstone that records what was lost being monument that preserves what mattered, that speaks across time, that testifies to human capacity for love and grief and memory, that shows us Romans not as historical actors on political stage, but as people who lived and loved and lost and mourned and wanted to be remembered. In Roman triumphs, in processions through streets of Rome where victorious generals paraded captives and displayed spoils taken in war, where crowds gathered to watch spectacle that celebrated military victories, where ritual followed established patterns that everyone recognized, where conquered peoples were led in chains before being executed or enslaved, where treasures looted from defeated enemies were carried through streets, where general rode in chariot dressed as Jupiter wearing laurel crown while slaves stood behind him whispering, "Remember you are mortal," where triumph was highest honor Roman state could grant to military commander, where ceremony was designed to glorify conquest and to demonstrate empire's power and to reward successful generals and to entertain Roman people with spectacle of victory. Mary Beard sees not celebration to be admired but violence to be examined. Not glory to be praised, but brutality to be acknowledged, not greatness to be celebrated uncritically, but imperialism to be questioned, sees triumph as ritual that transformed violence of conquest into entertainment, that made suffering of conquered into spectacle for conquerors, that turned brutality into pageant, that celebrated through public ceremony what in unadorned terms was conquest through military force, subjugation of peoples who resisted Roman expansion. Violence inflicted to create empire, the triumph being designed to make acceptable through ceremony what might otherwise trouble, to transform through ritual what was in essence brutal, to celebrate what perhaps should be questioned. The triumphal procession followed route through city, followed path that took it past significant buildings, that brought it through areas where crowds could gather, that made spectacle visible to maximum number of people, that culminated at Temple of Jupiter where general would dedicate spoils, the route being designed for visibility, for maximum impact, for ensuring that triumph was seen by many, that its messages were communicated broadly, that spectacle reached large audience. Mary Beard reading route as evidence of triumph's public purposes, of how ceremony was designed to be witnessed, to impress viewers, to communicate messages about victory and power and Rome's military superiority, the route being path that transformed military achievement into public spectacle, that brought victory into city, that made conquest visible. The captives in chains were central spectacle, where conquered rulers or military commanders or other significant enemies paraded in humiliation before being executed, were being displayed to Roman crowds as trophies of victory, as evidence of conquest, as proof that enemies had been defeated, the display being degrading, being intentional humiliation, being demonstration of power over those who had resisted Rome, being statement that resistance ended in captivity and death. Marybeard reading display of captives as evidence of triumph's violence, of how ceremony celebrated subjugation, of how human suffering was transformed into spectacle, of how people who had fought for their freedom or for their kingdoms were reduced to objects of Roman entertainment, the captives being testimony to brutality that triumph celebrated, to violence that ceremony transformed into acceptable public entertainment. The spoils displayed included treasures, included gold and silver looted from conquered territories, included sacred objects taken from temples, included artworks and weapons and everything valuable that could be seized, the display being demonstration of wealth acquired through conquest, being evidence of resources that empire brought to Rome, being showing what victory meant materially, the spoils being testimony to plunder, to appropriation, to how conquest translated into wealth for conquerors. Marybeard reading spoils as evidence of imperialism's economic dimensions, of how war enriched Rome, of how conquest was motivated by and resulted in transfer of resources from conquered to conquerors, the treasures being beautiful objects but being evidence of theft sanctioned by military victory. The general's costume emphasized divine status, emphasized through wearing triumphal regalia that made him appear as Jupiter, through painting face red like cult statue, through carrying scepter and wearing laurel crown, through appearing as God temporarily as embodiment of divine power that guaranteed Roman victory, the costume being statement about relationship between military success and divine favor, being claiming that victory proved God supported Rome, that conquest was divinely sanctioned. Marybeard reading costume as evidence of ideology, of how triumph connected military achievement to religious legitimation, of how generals claimed divine authority, of how ceremony made conquest seem not just successful but divinely ordained, the costume transforming general into God temporarily, elevating him above human status, making victory into sacred event. The slave whispering, "Remember you are mortal," provided counterpoint, provided reminder that despite godlike appearance general was human, that triumph was temporary elevation, that he remained subject to mortality, to human limitations, the whisper being check on hubris, being reminder not to claim divinity permanently, being acknowledgement that triumph's elevation was ritual rather than reality, Marybeard reading whisper as evidence of ambivalence about triumph. Of recognition that elevation it provided was dangerous, that it risked making general overreach, that ritual needed internal reminder of limits even while elevating general to divine status, the whisper being testimony to Roman awareness of hubris, of dangers of excessive pride, of need to maintain limits even in moment of greatest celebration. The execution of captives ceremony concluded with captured leaders being executed, typically by strangling in prison, the execution being occurring after triumph, being final act that completed humiliation, that ended captives' suffering, that removed any possibility they might return to lead resistance, the execution being brutal necessity in Roman view, being ensuring that defeated enemies could not threaten Rome again, being final demonstration of power. Marybeard reading executions as evidence of triumph's violence, of how celebration ended in killing, of how spectacle concluded with death, of how ceremony that entertained masses ended with elimination of those displayed, the executions being testimony to triumph's brutality, to violence that celebration obscured, to killing that was necessary conclusion, to ritual that celebrated conquest. The popular appeal of triumphs was significant, was triumphs being rare events that drew large crowds, that were entertainment and education and political theater, that showed people spectacles they rarely witnessed, that demonstrated empires' reach and power, that provided entertainment through displaying exotic captives and treasures from distant lands, that celebrated victories that brought wealth and security, the appeal being real, being testimony to how Romans valued military success. How they enjoyed spectacles, how they participated in imperial ideology through watching and celebrating conquests. Mary Beard acknowledging appeal while questioning it, while asking what it meant that Romans found entertainment in displays of conquered peoples, in parades of chained captives, in celebration of violence, the appeal being evidence of culture that accepted and celebrated imperialism, that found pleasure in demonstrations of power over others. The triumph where violence became spectacle is ceremony that Mary Beard critically examines not to celebrate but to question, not to admire but to understand, not to accept on empire's terms, but to analyze for what it reveals about values, about imperialism, about how violence was transformed through ritual into acceptable entertainment, about how brutality was celebrated through public ceremony, about how conquest was justified through divine authorization. About how suffering of conquered was made into spectacle for conquerors' entertainment, the examination being critical, being refusing to accept triumph as simply glorious ceremony, being insisting on recognizing violence it celebrated, brutality it transformed, imperialism it expressed, the triumph being testimony to Rome's power and to its values, being evidence of culture that celebrated conquest, that found entertainment in humiliation of defeated enemies. That transformed violence into spectacle, that made killing into conclusion of public ritual. The triumph where violence became spectacle being ceremony that reveals when examined critically not greatness to be celebrated but brutality to be acknowledged, not achievement to be admired uncritically but imperialism to be questioned, not simply military success but violence that success required, suffering it inflicted, lives it ended, peoples it subjugated. The triumph being evidence that Mary Beard reads against grain, that she examines critically, that she refuses to celebrate without acknowledging costs, without recognizing violence, without questioning values that made such celebration acceptable. The triumph being monument to power but also being testimony to brutality, being celebration but also being evidence of violence, being spectacle but also being truth about empire that spectacle attempted to obscure. Mary Beard's approach to Roman history is characterized not by providing definitive accounts that settle all questions, but by asking better questions, by acknowledging what we do not know rather than pretending to know more than evidence supports, by being comfortable with ambiguity rather than forcing clarity where sources are unclear, by recognizing that historical understanding is always provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence emerges or when new questions are asked or when old evidence is reinterpreted, by being honest about limits of what we can recover from fragmentary sources that are biased and incomplete, by questioning sources rather than accepting them at face value, by reading against grain rather than simply following what texts say, by attending to silences and absences rather than only cataloging what is present, by seeking voices of marginalized rather than only studying powerful, by examining power structures rather than accepting hierarchies as natural, by being critical of empire rather than celebrating it uncritically, by refusing to let Rome's own propaganda about itself stand as historical truth, by insisting that understanding Rome requires questioning Rome, requires recognizing its violence alongside its achievements, requires acknowledging its exploitation alongside its organization, requires seeing enslaved people and conquered peoples and women alongside elite men, requires practicing history as critical inquiry rather than as accepting tradition, the legacy being not complete account of Rome that answers all questions but being way of thinking about Rome that asks better questions, that is more critical, that is more honest about limits, that is more attentive to those whom source is marginalized, that refuses easy celebrations, that insists on complexity. The critical reading of sources is fundamental, is refusing to accept what ancient texts say without examining who wrote them and why, without considering what biases shaped them, without recognizing what they exclude or minimize, without understanding how power shaped what was recorded and what was forgotten. The critical reading being method that Beard practices consistently, that she teaches through her work, that she demonstrates by showing how sources betray their authors. How texts reveal more than they intend, how reading against grain uncovers evidence that sources did not mean to preserve, the method being essential to recovering more complete picture of Rome than sources intended to provide, being tool for seeing beyond elite male perspectives that dominate sources, being approach that makes possible recovering voices and experiences that official memory did not value, the critical reading being Beard's primary contribution to how Rome is studied. The attention to gender transforms understanding transforms by making visible women who are absent from political narratives, by questioning why women are excluded from public commemoration, by recognizing that women's absence from sources reflects patriarchy rather than reflecting that women did not matter, by insisting that understanding Rome requires understanding half of population that sources systematically marginalize. By reading sources for what they reveal about women despite not being focused on women, by using diverse evidence including epitaphs and archaeology and casual mentions in texts to recover what can be recovered about women's lives, the attention being corrective to traditional Roman history that focused overwhelmingly on men, being insistence that women's history matters. Being recognition that gender shaped everything in Roman world, and that understanding gender is essential to understanding Rome, the transformation being how Beard has made gender central to Roman history in ways that earlier scholarship often did not. The acknowledgement of slavery's centrality is crucial, is recognizing that enslaved people were perhaps one-third of population, that they performed labor that made everything else possible, that they were essential to Roman economy and society, that understanding Rome requires understanding slavery, that sources' silence about enslaved people reflects power structures rather than reflecting that enslaved people were unimportant, the acknowledgement being making visible what sources tried to render invisible. Being insisting that enslaved people's history matters even when recovering it is difficult, being refusing to write Roman history as if slavery were minor detail rather than being central institution, the centrality being something Beard insists on, being recognition that Rome cannot be understood without understanding slavery, that any account of Rome that marginalizes slavery is incomplete. The critique of empire is consistent, is refusing to celebrate Roman conquest uncritically, is insisting on acknowledging violence that empire entailed, is recognizing that expansion meant subjugation of peoples who did not choose to be ruled, is understanding that empire's benefits for Romans came at costs for conquered peoples, is questioning triumphalist narratives that present empire as bringing civilization, is examining how Roman ideology justified conquest, is being honest about brutality alongside achievements, the critique being not rejection of studying Rome but being insistence on studying Rome honestly, on recognizing both what Rome achieved and what costs those achievements entailed, on refusing to accept Rome's propaganda about itself as historical truth, the critique being essential to Beard's approach, being what distinguishes her work from traditional celebrations of Roman greatness. The use of diverse sources expands possibilities, is using not just literary texts, but also inscriptions, archaeology, papyri, coins, art, architecture, everything that survives from Roman world, is recognizing that different sources reveal different aspects of Roman life, that inscriptions preserve voices that literature does not, that archaeology reveals material conditions that texts do not describe, that papyri from Egypt preserve documentary evidence that survives nowhere else. The diversity being essential to recovering fuller picture, being allowing access to people and activities and dimensions of life that literary sources do not document, being making possible social history and economic history and women's history, and enslaved people's history that relying only on literary sources would not permit, the diverse sources being tools that Beard uses extensively, being evidence that she values and interprets carefully. The honesty about limits is refreshing, is Beard being willing to say when we do not know something, when evidence is insufficient, when interpretations are uncertain, when sources are silent and silences cannot be filled, the honesty being contrast to scholarship that speaks confidently about matters that sources barely address, being recognition that acknowledging limits is more honest than pretending to know more than we can know, being understanding that historical knowledge is always incomplete. Always provisional, always subject to revision, the honesty being characteristic of Beard's work, being making her scholarship trustworthy because she does not claim more than evidence supports, because she is clear about what we can know and what we cannot know, the limits being acknowledged rather than being hidden. The accessibility of presentation matters that Beard writes for general audiences as well as for specialists, that she appears on television and radio, that she engages public through social media, that she makes Roman history accessible to people who are not classicists, that she writes clearly without sacrificing sophistication, that she communicates complex ideas in ways that non-specialists can understand, the accessibility being democratic impulse. Being belief that history should not be confined to academics, that public has right to serious historical scholarship presented accessibly, that making history accessible is worthwhile goal, the accessibility being achieved without dumbing down, being presenting serious scholarship in clear prose, being making Roman history available to broader audiences, being Beard's contribution to public understanding of ancient world. The challenges to tradition are valuable because they force re-examination of assumptions, because they question narratives that have been accepted without sufficient scrutiny, because they make visible what traditional scholarship overlooked, because they open new areas of inquiry, because they demonstrate that there are always new questions to ask, new perspectives to adopt, new evidence to interpret, the challenges being not destruction of tradition but being enrichment of it. Being expansion of what Roman history includes, being transformation of how Rome is studied, the value being in making Roman history richer, more complete, more honest, more attentive to all Romans rather than only to elite males, more critical of power rather than accepting it, more questioning rather than simply accepting. The inspiration for new scholarship is significant, is Beard's work inspiring younger scholars to ask similar questions, to adopt critical approaches, to study marginalized groups, to question sources, to practice history as inquiry rather than as repetition of tradition, the inspiration being visible in scholarship that follows approaches Beard has pioneered, that builds on foundations she has laid, that extends questions she has asked to new areas, the inspiration being legacy that matters. Being transformation of field that continues through scholars who learned from her, who adopted her methods, who pursue similar goals of making Roman history more complete, more critical, more honest. The legacy that lives in questions not answers is Mary Beard's contribution to Roman history, is contribution that is methodological rather than being primarily about specific historical claims, is about how to approach sources rather than about what sources definitively reveal, is about practicing critical history rather than about accepting traditional narratives, is about asking better questions rather than about providing final answers, is about acknowledging complexity rather than forcing simplicity, is about being honest about limits rather than pretending to certainty, is about including marginalized rather than focusing only on powerful, is about questioning empire rather than celebrating it, is about reading critically rather than accepting uncritically, is about recognizing that historical understanding is provisional, is ongoing inquiry, is never finished, is always open to revision, is always capable of asking new questions, is always finding new perspectives, is always discovering new evidence or new ways of interpreting old evidence, the legacy being questions that continue to be asked, being critical approaches that continue to be refined, being commitment to honesty that continues to guide scholarship, being insistence on complexity that continues to resist oversimplification, being attention to marginalized that continues to recover voices. Being critique of power that continues to examine structures, being Mary Beard's transformation of how Rome is studied, being her gift to Roman history, being her demonstration that history is alive when it questions, is dead when it only repeats, is valuable when it acknowledges limits, is honest when it admits uncertainty, is rich when it includes all people, is critical when it examines power, is complete when it recognizes complexity, the legacy living in questions, not answers. In approaches, not conclusions, in methods, not claims, in ongoing inquiry, not settled truth, in Mary Beard's Rome that is more complex, more honest, more complete, more critical than traditional Rome, in her history that questions rather than accepts, that examines rather than celebrates, that includes rather than excludes, that acknowledges rather than hides, that practices critical inquiry rather than repeating tradition. The legacy that lives in questions, not answers, being Mary Beard's contribution. Being her transformation, being her gift, being questions that continue, being inquiry that persists, being history that remains alive through questioning, through critical thinking, through refusing easy answers, through insisting on complexity, through pursuing truth even when truth is complicated, through practicing history as it should be practiced critically, honestly, inclusively, thoughtfully, the legacy living in questions, not answers, forever questioning, forever critical, forever honest, forever seeking. Forever Mary Beard's approach to understanding Rome.